The call came at 3:47 on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing manufacturing compliance reports in my corner office. My mother's voice cracked through the phone like breaking glass. Dad had collapsed at his workshop, clutching his chest gone before the paramedics arrived. Heart attack. Sudden. Final. I stared at the federal certification documents scattered across my desk, watching tears blur the government seals I'd spent years earning. When I knocked on my boss Marcus's door an hour later to request bereavement leave for the funeral, he leaned back in his leather chair and sneered. Taking bereavement leave for your father's funeral shows poor judgment. Pack up. The next morning, a federal marshal walked into our boardroom demanding to know where the required qualified person was holding up a stop production order that would change everything. I stood in Marcus's glass-walled office overlooking the factory floor, my hands trembling as I explained the sudden loss that had shattered my world. My father, 63 years old, had been teaching woodworking classes at the community center when his heart simply stopped beating. The funeral director needed my input on arrangements my mother couldn't handle the decisions alone, and our family needed me during this devastating time. Marcus Pemberton, 45 years old with silver temples and an expensive suit that probably cost more than most workers' monthly salaries, listened with the expression of someone enduring an inconvenient interruption. His corner office displayed framed photos from golf tournaments and business awards, creating a shrine to his own success. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the massive production facility where 200 employees manufactured precision components for government contractors. Tasha, I understand you're experiencing personal difficulties, Marcus said, drumming his manicured fingers against his mahogany desk. However, successful professionals learn to compartmentalize emotional challenges. Grief is a luxury we cannot afford during peak production cycles. I felt my jaw drop slightly. Marcus, my father died yesterday. The funeral is Friday. I need 3 days to handle arrangements and support my family. His laugh held no warmth whatsoever. 3 days, our quarterly delivery deadline approaches in 2 weeks. Every government contract depends on maintaining production schedules without interruption. Emotional instability creates operational risks we simply cannot tolerate. I've never missed a deadline in 4 years, I protested, gesturing toward the compliance certificates hanging on his wall that bore my signature. My federal manufacturing certifications ensure this facility operates within regulatory parameters. You know how critical those qualifications are for maintaining our contracts. Marcus waved dismissively as if swatting away an annoying insect. Regulatory paperwork requires basic engineering knowledge, nothing more. Any competent technician can handle compliance documentation. Your specialized salary represents an unnecessary expense during cost reduction initiatives. My stomach dropped as he opened his desk drawer and withdrew a manila folder I'd never seen before. Inside were photocopied reports documenting minor infractions spanning several months, arriving 4 minutes late during a snowstorm, leaving early for a dental appointment, taking an extended lunch break when my car wouldn't start. Each incident had been carefully noted, dated, and filed away like ammunition for this exact moment. Your performance record demonstrates concerning patterns, Marcus continued, sliding the folder across his desk. Attendance irregularities, priority confusion, and now this emotional breakdown over personal matters. These behaviors indicate someone unsuited for high responsibility positions. You're firing me for asking for bereavement leave, I whispered, unable to process the cruelty unfolding before my eyes. I'm terminating an employee whose personal priorities interfere with professional obligations, he corrected smugly. Fortunately, I've already identified your replacement. My nephew Bradley graduated from State University with an engineering degree last spring. He's eager to contribute meaningfully to our organization while earning significantly less compensation. Bradley Pemberton, 23 years old, fresh-faced, and completely unqualified for federal compliance oversight. I'd met him during family picnics Marcus hosted for senior staff, where Bradley spent most conversations bragging about fraternity parties and his sports car. The idea of him handling intricate government regulations made my blood run cold. Bradley has zero experience with federal manufacturing standards, I protested desperately. The Department of Defense requires continuous qualified oversight for classified component production. Without proper certification, this facility violates multiple federal statutes. Marcus stood up, straightening his silk tie with obvious satisfaction. Young professionals adapt quickly to new responsibilities. Bradley brings fresh energy and cost-effective solutions to outdated processes. Perhaps if you'd focused more on efficiency and less on emotional dramatics, this conversation might have proceeded differently. The termination letter he handed me was already printed, signed, and dated from the previous week. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision triggered by my bereavement request. Marcus had been planning my dismissal for weeks, possibly months, waiting for the perfect opportunity to execute his scheme. My father's death had simply provided convenient timing for his predetermined agenda. "Security will escort you to collect personal belongings," Marcus announced, pressing his intercom button. "Please surrender all access cards, company property, and confidential materials immediately. Your final paycheck will reflect appropriate deductions for early contract termination." Through his office windows, I watched Bradley Pemberton strutting across the factory floor wearing a brand new hard hat and safety vest that still had creases from packaging. Workers stared at him with confusion and concern, clearly wondering why this obvious novice was touring their sophisticated production environment. Bradley paused at each workstation, nodding earnestly, while veteran employees explained processes he obviously didn't understand. Marcus joined me at the window, practically glowing with self-satisfaction. Bradley possesses natural leadership qualities and innovative thinking. He'll revolutionize our compliance procedures while eliminating unnecessary bureaucratic obstacles that have hindered our efficiency. I gathered my few personal items from my desk, while Security Officer Frank Wilson watched with obvious discomfort. Frank had worked here for 15 years and understood the critical nature of federal oversight. His apologetic expression conveyed what he couldn't say aloud: this decision would have catastrophic consequences. As I walked toward the exit carrying my small cardboard box, I passed Bradley's temporary workstation where he was spreading out engineering textbooks and frantically taking notes. He looked up with nervous enthusiasm, clearly hoping to make a good impression on his new colleagues. The weight of impending disaster settled heavily on my shoulders as I realized what would happen once federal inspectors discovered the facility lacked qualified oversight. The lobby's glass doors closed behind me with an ominous finality sealing my fate, while setting in motion events that would ultimately prove Marcus's arrogance had consequences far beyond his imagination. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching the somber mood that had settled over our household, while funeral preparations consumed every conversation. I sat at my kitchen table, still in my pajamas, scrolling through job listings on my laptop when my phone began vibrating insistently. Sarah Chen from payroll was calling, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Tasha, thank God you answered," she whispered urgently. "There's a federal marshal here demanding to speak with you. Marcus is freaking out. Bradley locked himself in the bathroom and nobody knows what to do." My coffee mug froze halfway to my lips. "What kind of federal marshal?" "Manufacturing compliance enforcement. She's got badges, official paperwork, and she's asking very specific questions about overnight production runs. Marcus keeps trying to explain that Bradley's handling everything now, but she's not buying it." I closed my laptop and headed upstairs to get dressed, my mind racing through federal regulations that might have triggered an unannounced inspection. Overnight shifts had been running continuously to meet the quarterly deadline Marcus obsessed over, but those operations required qualified supervision according to Department of Defense contractor requirements. Is she alone? I asked while pulling on professional attire. No, she's got two assistants with her, and they're photographing everything. The production floor is completely shut down because she issued some kind of emergency order. Workers are just standing around looking confused. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the facility parking lot and immediately noticed the government vehicles positioned near the main entrance. Black sedans with federal license plates and radio antennas suggested this wasn't a routine paperwork review. Through the lobby windows, I could see Marcus gesticulating wildly while a stern-looking woman in a navy blazer took notes. Federal Marshal Janet Rodriguez stood about 5 feet 6 inches tall, with graying brown hair pulled back in a professional bun and sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. Her credentials hung from a lanyard around her neck, clearly displaying her authority to investigate and enforce federal manufacturing regulations. 2 younger agents flanked her position, each carrying thick folders and digital cameras. Where is the named qualified person responsible for overnight operations? Marshal Rodriguez was asking when I entered the lobby. Her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. Marcus spotted me immediately, relief flooding his features as if I might somehow solve the crisis he'd created. Tasha, perfect timing. Perhaps you can clarify some technical details for Marshal Rodriguez regarding our compliance procedures. The marshal turned toward me with professional interest, consulting her tablet before speaking. Are you Tasha Williams, holder of Federal Manufacturing Certification numbers 78419215 and 10437? Yes, I am, I confirmed while Marcus's expression shifted from relief to confusion. According to Department of Defense contractor records, you are designated as the required qualified person for this facility's classified component production. Federal statute requires your physical presence during all manufacturing operations involving government contracts. Where were you between 11 p.m. last night and 7 a.m. this morning? The question hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Marcus's face went pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Bradley emerged from wherever he'd been hiding, looking like he might vomit from stress and embarrassment. I was terminated yesterday afternoon, I explained calmly. Marcus Pemberton relieved me of all duties and revoked my access to this facility. Marshal Rodriguez's eyebrows rose slightly as she made notes on her tablet. Mr. Pemberton, are you aware that terminating a required qualified person without federal notification and replacement approval constitutes a serious violation of manufacturing compliance statutes? Marcus stammered incoherently, clearly having no idea such regulations existed. His nephew Bradley stood frozen beside an expensive piece of machinery he obviously couldn't operate wearing safety equipment like a costume rather than professional gear. Furthermore, the marshal continued, our preliminary investigation reveals that 17 hours of production occurred without qualified oversight, potentially compromising $12 million worth of government contracts. Each component manufactured during that period requires individual inspection and possible replacement. The facility's main production floor stretched out behind glass partition walls, revealing millions of dollars worth of sophisticated equipment now sitting silent and idle. 200 workers stood at their stations, uncertain whether to continue their tasks or await further instructions. The sudden halt in operations created an eerie quiet, broken only by the hum of ventilation systems. Marshal Rodriguez, Marcus began desperately. Surely we can resolve this misunderstanding quickly. Bradley here has an engineering degree and can certainly handle basic oversight responsibilities until we complete proper documentation. She consulted her tablet again, then looked up with an expression that could freeze water. Mr. Bradley Pemberton possesses a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering with no federal certifications, no security clearance, and no training in classified manufacturing protocols. He is legally prohibited from accessing production areas without qualified supervision. Bradley's face turned crimson as every person in the lobby focused their attention on his obvious inadequacy. His expensive hard hat suddenly looked like a child's toy, and his confident swagger had completely evaporated under professional scrutiny. "What exactly does this mean for our operations?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marshal Rodriguez removed a thick document from her briefcase and placed it on the reception desk with ceremonial finality. "This facility is hereby subject to an immediate stop production order until compliance is restored. All manufacturing operations must cease within 30 minutes. Government contracts are suspended pending investigation. Daily penalties begin accruing at $200,000 per day until violations are corrected." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at the official document as if hoping it might disappear through force of will. Bradley slumped against the wall, finally comprehending that his uncle's cost-saving scheme had backfired spectacularly. "How long will this investigation take?" Marcus whispered. "That depends entirely on how quickly you can restore qualified oversight and demonstrate compliance with all federal requirements," the marshal replied. "Given the nature of these violations, we estimate a minimum of 2 weeks for preliminary review, assuming immediate corrective action." 2 weeks. At $200,000 per day, the penalties alone would exceed $2.5 million. Combined with lost production revenue, delayed delivery penalties, and potential contract cancellations, Marcus was staring at financial catastrophe. As I walked back to my car, I could hear Marcus desperately trying to negotiate with the federal agents, while Bradley quietly asked someone to call his mother. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd dismissed my expertise as unnecessary was now discovering exactly how essential it had been to his entire operation. 2 days later, I stood beside my father's casket in the funeral home's main chapel, accepting condolences from family friends and former colleagues who'd known Dad for decades. The mahogany casket was surrounded by flower arrangements that filled the room with the scent of lilies and roses, creating a bittersweet atmosphere of love and loss. Dad would have appreciated the turnout, especially seeing his former students from the community center woodworking classes he'd taught for over 15 years. My mother, dressed in her best black dress and leaning heavily on my arm, greeted each visitor with quiet dignity despite her overwhelming grief. She'd been married to Dad for 38 years, and their partnership had been the foundation of our family's stability. Now she faced an uncertain future without her life companion, and I was determined to provide whatever support she needed. "Tasha, I'm so sorry for your loss," whispered Mrs. Henderson, our former neighbor who'd moved to Florida 5 years ago but flew back for the service. "Your father was such a kind man, always willing to help with home repair projects or lend his tools to anyone who needed them." I was thanking her when I noticed my younger brother David approaching from across the room. At 28 years old, he wore an expensive charcoal gray suit with Italian leather shoes and a silk tie that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries. His investment banking career in downtown Chicago had provided him with material success, but apparently hadn't taught him appropriate timing or sensitivity. David embraced me with a perfunctory hug that felt more like a business greeting than family comfort. His cologne was expensive but overpowering, and his manicured hands had never known the kind of honest work that had defined our father's life. Where Dad's hands bore scars from decades of craftsmanship, David's were soft and pale from pushing papers and manipulating financial instruments. "How are you holding up, sis?" he asked with false concern, glancing around the chapel as if calculating the cost of the funeral arrangements. "I heard through the grapevine that you've had some professional challenges recently. Losing a job during family crisis must be particularly stressful." Something in his tone raised immediate red flags. David had always resented my technical expertise and the respect it earned from industry professionals. While he'd chosen finance for its prestige and earning potential, my specialized certifications commanded genuine reverence from manufacturing executives who understood their value. "It's been difficult," I replied cautiously, unwilling to discuss workplace drama during our father's funeral. "But I'm focused on supporting Mom right now and honoring Dad's memory appropriately." David's laugh was entirely inappropriate for our surroundings. Several mourners turned to stare at him with disapproval, clearly offended by his casual attitude during such a solemn occasion. "Tasha, you always were naive about business realities. Real professionals don't get fired from essential positions. Perhaps if you developed better relationship management skills instead of hiding behind technical certifications, this situation could have been avoided." My mother looked up sharply, confused by the tension suddenly crackling between her children during what should have been a time of family unity. I guided her toward a quiet corner, hoping to prevent David from creating a scene that would taint Dad's memorial service. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked quietly, keeping my voice low to avoid disturbing other mourners. David straightened his tie with obvious smugness, clearly preparing to deliver information he considered advantageous. "I've been consulting with Marcus Pemberton about optimizing his operational expenses. Your position represented a significant cost center without corresponding revenue generation. Smart businesses eliminate unnecessary overhead during competitive periods. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. You convinced Marcus to fire me. I provided objective financial analysis about staffing inefficiencies," David corrected, examining his manicured fingernails with studied indifference. "Marcus paid handsomely for my expertise in identifying cost reduction opportunities. Your inflated salary for essentially pushing paperwork was an obvious target for elimination." Around us, family friends continued sharing memories of our father's generosity and wisdom, completely unaware that one of his sons was systematically destroying the other's career for personal profit. The contrast between Dad's legacy of helping others and David's selfish opportunism couldn't have been more stark. "You earned consulting fees by getting me fired," I whispered, struggling to process such calculated betrayal. "Business is business, Tasha. Emotional attachments cloud professional judgment." David adjusted his expensive watch, a gift he'd given himself after closing a particularly lucrative deal. "I convinced Marcus that any competent engineer could handle regulatory compliance. Specialized certifications are just expensive credentials that inflate salaries without adding real value." Mrs. Patterson, Dad's former supervisor at the lumber yard, approached us with tears in her eyes. "Your father taught my grandson everything he knows about woodworking. We'll never forget his patience and kindness with young people learning the trade." David smiled politely at her while I thanked her for the kind words, but internally I was reeling from his admissions. Not only had he orchestrated my termination, but he'd convinced Marcus to replace me with Bradley specifically to maximize cost savings and his own consulting revenue. "Have you found new employment yet?" David continued after Mrs. Patterson moved away. "I might be able to help you find an entry-level position at my firm. Nothing too demanding, obviously, but something appropriate for your skill level. The financial industry values analytical thinking, though you'd need extensive training to understand investment complexities." His condescending offer was the final straw. "David, your financial expertise just cost Marcus's company $12 million in government contracts and $200,000 per day in federal penalties. Your brilliant cost-cutting strategy triggered a federal investigation that could bankrupt the entire operation." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across David's confident expression. "What federal investigation?" The one that started when federal marshals discovered that overnight production violated compliance regulations because you convinced Marcus to eliminate essential oversight. Everything you thought you knew about that business was completely wrong. Several family members had gathered close enough to overhear our conversation, their faces reflecting shock and disappointment at David's callous behavior during our father's funeral. Uncle Robert, Dad's older brother, shook his head sadly while Aunt Mary whispered to her husband about David's inappropriate conduct. "You're just trying to make yourself feel better about getting fired," David said defensively, but his voice lacked its previous conviction. "Regulatory compliance is basic paperwork management. No specialized knowledge required." Then why is Marcus desperately trying to hire replacement compliance officers at twice my former salary? I challenged. Why are federal agents investigating 5 years of production records? Why is the entire facility shut down until qualified oversight is restored? David's face went pale as he began to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. His financial expertise in manipulating investment portfolios hadn't prepared him to evaluate the regulatory complexities of federal manufacturing contracts. He'd destroyed my career based on assumptions that were not only wrong, but catastrophically expensive. As we prepared for the funeral service to begin, I realized that David's jealousy and greed had inadvertently created an opportunity for me to demonstrate my true professional value. His betrayal hurt deeply, especially during our family's time of grief, but it had also revealed the irreplaceable nature of expertise that couldn't be outsourced or eliminated through cost-cutting schemes. The following Monday morning, I received the first of what would become dozens of increasingly frantic phone calls from Marcus. I was sitting in my mother's kitchen helping her sort through insurance paperwork and funeral expenses when my phone began buzzing insistently at 8:37 a.m. "Tasha, thank goodness!" Marcus's voice cracked through the speaker with obvious desperation. "We need to discuss your immediate return to resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding. I'm prepared to offer very generous compensation for your assistance during this challenging period." I let the call go to voicemail along with the subsequent 7 attempts he made throughout the morning. By noon, my voicemail box was completely full, with increasingly panicked messages from Marcus Bradley, Human Resources Director Linda Foster, and even the company's legal counsel demanding immediate callback for urgent discussion. Through my network of former colleagues still working at the facility, I learned that the situation had deteriorated far beyond Marcus's initial comprehension. Production manager Steve Rodriguez called during his lunch break to provide updates on the unfolding catastrophe. "Tasha, it's absolutely chaos here," Steve whispered into his phone from the parking lot. "The federal marshals have expanded their investigation to include the past 5 years of production records. They're questioning every supervisor about safety protocols, documentation procedures, and compliance training that nobody can adequately explain. The facility's 200 workers were reporting for their shifts, but spending their time cleaning equipment and organizing inventory instead of manufacturing components. Without qualified oversight to authorize production activities, the sophisticated machinery sat silent, while wages and overhead costs continued accumulating without corresponding revenue generation. What about Bradley?" I asked, genuinely curious about how Marcus's nephew was handling the pressure. Steve's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "Bradley lasted exactly 3 days before submitting his resignation letter. Apparently, he realized that federal compliance requires actual expertise rather than just enthusiasm and family connections. He's back in graduate school now, pursuing something completely unrelated to manufacturing. The abandoned workstation where Bradley had spread his engineering textbooks now stood empty, serving as a monument to nepotism and poor judgment. His brief tenure had accomplished nothing beyond highlighting the vast gap between academic theory and practical regulatory knowledge. "How are the government contracts holding up?" I inquired, though I suspected I already knew the answer. That's the worst part, Steve continued grimly. The Department of Defense suspended our primary contract pending investigation results. We were supposed to deliver 1,500 precision components by month's end, but now those orders are being redirected to our competitors. $12 million worth of business gone. Major clients who'd relied on the facility's production capacity for their own manufacturing schedules were scrambling to find alternative suppliers. The ripple effects extended far beyond Marcus's company, affecting dozens of downstream businesses that depended on timely component delivery for their own operations. Marcus has been calling recruitment agencies all week, Steve added. Turns out qualified federal compliance officers are incredibly rare and expensive. The few candidates he's found are demanding double your former salary, plus signing bonuses, relocation expenses, and guaranteed contract terms. One potential hire had quoted an annual salary of $150,000 compared to my previous $75,000 plus a $25,000 signing bonus and 6 months of guaranteed employment regardless of performance. Another candidate required 3 months advance notice before starting, which would extend the production shutdown well into the next quarter. There's something else, Steve continued, lowering his voice even further. The insurance company sent investigators last Thursday. Apparently, operating without proper compliance oversight violates our liability coverage terms. They're threatening to cancel our policy retroactively, which would void protection for the past 6 months of operations. Without insurance coverage, the company would be personally liable for any workplace accidents, environmental violations, or product defects discovered during the federal investigation. Marcus's cost-cutting decision had exponentially increased his financial exposure while eliminating the very protections that insurance companies required. How's Marcus holding up? I asked, though I felt no sympathy for his self-inflicted predicament. He's lost at least 10 pounds from stress and hasn't slept in days. His wife Margaret is furious about Bradley's involvement and keeps calling him an idiot for listening to David's advice. Yesterday, he was in his office crying actual tears while reviewing financial projections that show bankruptcy within 60 days if production doesn't resume immediately. The irony was perfect. Marcus had eliminated my position to save approximately $15,000 in quarterly salary expenses, but his decision was now costing the company over $200,000 daily in penalties alone. Combined with lost revenue replacement hiring costs and potential insurance claims, his savings strategy had generated losses exceeding $10 million. My phone buzzed with another incoming call from the facility. This time it was Linda Foster from Human Resources, her voice tight with professional desperation. Tasha, I'm calling on behalf of the entire management team to request an emergency meeting. We understand there were communication issues surrounding your departure, and we're prepared to discuss immediate reinstatement with significantly improved compensation and benefits. I declined politely but firmly, explaining that I was still processing my father's death and couldn't consider employment discussions during my grieving period. The truth was more complex. I'd already begun exploring independent consulting opportunities that would provide greater control over my professional destiny. Please, Linda continued, abandoning professional composure entirely. Marcus is talking about mortgage his house to cover operating expenses. The bank froze our credit line until the federal investigation concludes. We're paying daily penalties that exceed most people's annual salaries. Without your expertise, this company will cease to exist within months. After ending the call, I sat quietly in Mom's kitchen, reflecting on the dramatic reversal of circumstances. 1 week earlier, Marcus had dismissed my expertise as unnecessary overhead while treating my grief as professional weakness. Now he was discovering that specialized knowledge couldn't be replaced by enthusiasm or cost-cutting measures. The lesson was becoming clear to everyone involved. True professional value isn't determined by salary negotiations or office politics, but by irreplaceable expertise that becomes apparent only when it's absent. Marcus had learned this lesson in the most expensive way possible, and his education was far from complete. After 5 days of ignoring increasingly desperate phone calls, I finally decided to take Marcus's call while sitting in the conference room of employment attorney Jennifer Walsh's downtown office. Jennifer, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 50s with silver hair and an impressive track record of representing wrongfully terminated employees, had agreed to review my case after hearing the basic facts. "Tasha, thank God you answered," Marcus practically sobbed into the phone. "Please, I'm begging you to come back. We can work out whatever compensation you think is fair. Name your price and I'll approve it immediately." I activated the speakerphone function so Jennifer could listen to the conversation while taking detailed notes. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight smile that indicated she was hearing exactly what she'd hoped to hear. "Marcus, I appreciate your call, but I'm afraid returning to your company isn't possible at this time," I replied calmly, consulting the legal documents Jennifer had prepared during our initial consultation. "Not possible!" Marcus's voice cracked with desperation. "Tasha, you have to understand the situation we're facing. Federal investigators are crawling through 5 years of production records. Our insurance company is threatening cancellation. Major clients are demanding financial penalties for delayed deliveries. Without your expertise, this entire operation will collapse." Jennifer nodded approvingly as I continued with the script we'd rehearsed. "Marcus, during our last conversation, you made it very clear that my specialized certifications were unnecessary overhead and that any competent engineer could handle compliance requirements. You also stated that grief over my father's death demonstrated emotional instability incompatible with professional responsibilities." The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long before Marcus responded with obvious desperation. "I made some poor judgments under pressure. Obviously, I underestimated the complexity of your role and the importance of your qualifications. Please, can we schedule a meeting to discuss reinstatement terms?" "That won't be necessary," I replied, watching Jennifer organize photographs and documents we'd compiled over the past week. "I've spent considerable time consulting with federal regulators and employment attorneys about the circumstances surrounding my termination. The information I've gathered is quite illuminating." Jennifer handed me a thick folder containing correspondence with multiple government agencies. During the shutdown period, I'd used my extensive contacts within federal compliance circles to gather intelligence about Marcus's company and its history of regulatory shortcuts. "What kind of information?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well, for instance, I discovered that you've been implementing cost-cutting measures that violate safety protocols for the past 18 months. The modified ventilation system in Building C doesn't meet environmental standards for chemical processing. The overtime scheduling in Building A violates Department of Labor regulations for classified manufacturing. And the equipment maintenance deferrals you approved last quarter created safety hazards that OSHA would find very interesting." Marcus's sharp intake of breath confirmed that my investigation had uncovered problems he'd hoped would remain hidden. Every corner he'd cut to improve quarterly profits had created potential violations that federal agencies would scrutinize during their comprehensive investigation. "I've documented each safety shortcut you implemented every time you overrode my professional recommendations, and every instance where you prioritized profit margins over regulatory compliance." I continued reading from Jennifer's meticulously organized case file. "This information has been shared with appropriate federal oversight agencies." "Shared with federal agencies," Marcus stammered. "What exactly does that mean?" Jennifer gestured for me to continue while she activated her digital recorder to capture the remainder of our conversation. This call would become crucial evidence if legal proceedings became necessary. "I've filed formal complaints with the Occupational Safety and Health Administration regarding workplace safety violations the Environmental Protection Agency concerning improper chemical handling procedures, and the Department of Defense Contractor Oversight Division about security protocol breaches. Each agency has opened formal investigations based on the documentation I provided. The knowledge that multiple federal agencies were now scrutinizing his company's operations sent Marcus into barely controlled panic. What had begun as a simple compliance violation had expanded into a comprehensive investigation that could result in criminal charges if deliberate misconduct was discovered. "Tasha, surely we can resolve these issues internally," Marcus pleaded. "I'm willing to implement whatever changes you recommend and compensate you appropriately for consulting services. Please don't let this situation destroy everything my family has built over 3 generations. I'm afraid it's too late for internal resolution," I replied, noting the satisfaction in Jennifer's expression as she listened to Marcus's increasingly desperate admissions. "I've already accepted a consulting contract with Precision Dynamics Corporation to help them establish compliance protocols for their new government contracts." Precision Dynamics was Marcus's largest competitor, a progressive company that understood the value of regulatory expertise and invested appropriately in qualified personnel. Their human resources director had contacted me within hours of learning about my termination, offering consulting rates that exceeded my former annual salary for just 6 months of work. "You're working for Precision Dynamics." Marcus's voice rose to nearly a shout. "They're our biggest competitor. How can you do this to us?" "Professional relationships are built on mutual respect and appropriate compensation," I explained calmly. "Precision Dynamics values expertise and treats their consultants as essential partners rather than unnecessary overhead. They understand that compliance isn't just paperwork management, but specialized knowledge that protects their entire operation." Jennifer handed me another document from our case file, this one containing financial projections that demonstrated the long-term costs of Marcus's decision. We'd calculated that his cost-cutting measure would ultimately cost his company over $20 million in direct losses and opportunity costs. Furthermore, I continued, federal investigators have expressed particular interest in the timing of my termination. Firing a required qualified person immediately before violating compliance regulations suggests potential obstruction of federal oversight. They're investigating whether this was a deliberate attempt to avoid regulatory scrutiny. The suggestion that his actions might be interpreted as criminal obstruction sent Marcus into complete panic. What he'd intended as simple cost-cutting was now being evaluated as potentially deliberate interference with federal oversight responsibilities. "Please," Marcus whispered, his voice broken and defeated. "What can I do to fix this situation? I'll do anything you ask." "You can learn from this experience and treat future employees with appropriate respect," I replied, gathering my materials as Jennifer concluded her note-taking. "Professional expertise has value that extends far beyond salary negotiations. Perhaps, if you'd understood that principle from the beginning, this conversation would be unnecessary." After ending the call, Jennifer and I spent another hour reviewing the case materials we'd compiled. The combination of wrongful termination regulatory violations and documented safety shortcuts created a compelling foundation for legal action if Marcus attempted to retaliate or interfere with my new consulting opportunities. As I drove home from Jennifer's office, I reflected on how dramatically the situation had reversed in just 1 week. Marcus had dismissed my expertise as worthless overhead. Now he was discovering that specialized knowledge couldn't be replaced through wishful thinking or family connections. His education was proving far more expensive than he'd ever imagined, and the lessons were far from complete. 3 weeks after the federal investigation began, I was reviewing consulting contracts in my home office when my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen since Dad's funeral. David's name appeared on the caller ID, immediately raising my curiosity about what could prompt him to contact me after his cruel behavior during our family's time of grief. Tasha. David's voice sounded strained and entirely different from his usual confident tone. We need to talk. There's been a development in my situation that requires immediate family discussion. I leaned back in my desk chair, surrounded by consulting proposals from 3 different manufacturing companies seeking compliance expertise. The irony wasn't lost on me that David was calling for help, while my professional reputation was reaching new heights, despite his attempts to destroy it. What kind of development? I asked, genuinely curious about what could shake his typical arrogance. Federal investigators contacted my firm last Friday. David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. They're asking questions about my consulting relationship with Marcus and whether I properly disclosed my income from his company. My partners are demanding explanations I don't have. The satisfaction I felt was immediate and intense. David's scheme to profit from my destruction was now threatening his own career in ways he'd never anticipated. Federal investigations had a way of expanding far beyond their original scope, especially when they uncovered evidence of interconnected misconduct. What exactly are they investigating? I pressed, making notes about this new development for my attorney. Apparently, securities regulations require disclosure of any consulting income that might create conflicts of interest. When I advised Marcus about cost-cutting measures while simultaneously earning fees from implementing those recommendations, I created a financial relationship that should have been reported to my firm's compliance department. David's investment firm, Morrison Financial Partners, maintained strict policies about outside income and potential conflicts of interest. Partners were required to disclose any consulting relationships that might influence their professional judgment or create divided loyalties. His failure to report income from Marcus's company violated multiple firm policies and potentially federal securities laws. How much trouble are you facing? I asked, though his panicked tone already suggested the answer. 3 of my biggest clients withdrew their accounts yesterday. David continued, desperation creeping into his voice. They learned about the federal investigation through industry publications and decided they couldn't risk association with potential regulatory violations. I've lost over $40 million in managed assets in the past week. The financial industry's reputation-driven culture meant that even the suggestion of regulatory misconduct could destroy careers overnight. David's clients, primarily wealthy individuals and institutional investors, demanded absolute integrity from their financial advisors. Any hint of federal investigation sent them fleeing to competitors without hesitation. Morrison's executive committee scheduled a disciplinary hearing for next Tuesday, David added, his voice cracking slightly. They're reviewing my partnership status and considering termination for failure to disclose material conflicts of interest. 20 years of building my career, and it's all falling apart because of this Marcus situation. I found myself genuinely surprised by the rapid collapse of David's professional standing. While I'd hoped his betrayal would eventually create consequences, I hadn't anticipated federal securities violations or partnership termination. His greed had expanded a simple employment dispute into a complex regulatory investigation that threatened multiple careers. What do you want from me? I asked, directly tired of his circular explanations. I need you to help clear my name, David pleaded, abandoning any pretense of professional dignity. If you could contact federal investigators and explain that my advice to Marcus was based on legitimate business analysis rather than personal malice, it might help my situation. The request was breathtakingly audacious. David wanted me to help repair the reputation he'd damaged by orchestrating my termination for his personal profit. His complete lack of self-awareness about the irony of this request was almost impressive in its tone-deaf presumption. David, you earned consulting fees by convincing Marcus to eliminate my position, I reminded him calmly. You called me a financial amateur and suggested my expertise was worthless. You profited directly from destroying my career during our father's funeral. Why would I help you escape the consequences of those choices? The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable, broken only by David's labored breathing as he processed my refusal to rescue him from his self-created predicament. We're family, he finally whispered. Surely that counts for something despite our professional disagreements. Family members don't sabotage each other's careers for personal profit, I replied firmly. You chose money over loyalty, and now you're experiencing the natural consequences of that decision. I suggest you hire competent legal counsel and hope your violations weren't as serious as they appear. Please, David begged, his voice breaking completely. I made mistakes, but I didn't intend for things to escalate this far. The federal investigation, the securities violations, the partnership review, none of this was part of my plan. Consequences rarely match intentions, I observed. You intended to profit from my misfortune, but you accidentally triggered a federal investigation that exposed your own misconduct. Perhaps if you'd focused on legitimate business development instead of sabotaging family members, this situation could have been avoided. After ending the call, I sat quietly in my office, reflecting on the remarkable symmetry of recent events. David had convinced Marcus that my expertise was worthless, leading to his own professional destruction when that expertise proved irreplaceable. His attempt to profit from my downfall had created his own downfall through regulatory violations he'd never considered. The following Monday, I received an update from my former colleague Sarah Chen, who remained in contact despite her continued employment with Marcus's company. David's situation had continued deteriorating over the weekend as additional clients discovered his regulatory troubles through industry publications. Morrison Financial officially terminated his partnership, Sarah reported during our lunch meeting. The executive committee voted unanimously to sever all relationships and distance the firm from potential securities violations. David's been reduced to a junior analyst position at a much smaller company for about 30% of his former income. The dramatic reversal in David's circumstances served as a powerful reminder that expertise and integrity ultimately triumph over manipulation and shortcuts. His financial expertise in investment management hadn't prepared him to understand the regulatory complexities of federal manufacturing contracts, and his overconfidence had created consequences far beyond his imagination. As I prepared for my afternoon meeting with Precision Dynamics executives, I reflected on how both Marcus and David had learned expensive lessons about the value of specialized knowledge and ethical behavior. Their attempts to profit from my supposed weaknesses had ultimately revealed their own fundamental limitations and poor judgment. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of my new consulting firm, TW Compliance Solutions, reviewing quarterly reports that exceeded even my most optimistic projections. The morning sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown's business district, illuminating contracts with 7 major manufacturing companies seeking specialized regulatory expertise. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Chen, who'd finally left Marcus's struggling company to join my consulting team. Marcus just signed the final settlement agreement. $2.4 million in federal fines plus $800,000 in whistleblower compensation for you. Justice served. The federal investigation had concluded 3 months earlier with comprehensive findings that validated every concern I'd raised about Marcus's cost-cutting measures. The Department of Defense revoked his facility's security clearance, permanently eliminating any possibility of future government contracts. The Environmental Protection Agency imposed ongoing monitoring requirements that would cost hundreds of thousands annually. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration mandated facility upgrades exceeding $1 million. Marcus had been forced to sell 43% of his company to an investment group willing to provide emergency funding in exchange for controlling interest and management oversight. He remained as general manager, but reported to a board of directors who reviewed every significant decision to prevent future regulatory violations. The public apology Marcus delivered at the Regional Manufacturing Association's annual conference became legendary within industry circles. Standing before 200 of his peers, he acknowledged that his cost-cutting strategies had nearly bankrupted a 3-generation family business because he'd failed to understand the true value of regulatory expertise.
"I learned the most expensive lesson of my career,"
Marcus had admitted during his presentation about compliance best practices. Specialized knowledge isn't overhead to be eliminated, but essential infrastructure that protects everything we've built. My arrogance cost my company over $15 million and nearly destroyed 87 jobs. Bradley Pemberton had returned to graduate school pursuing environmental engineering with a newfound appreciation for regulatory complexity. His brief exposure to federal compliance requirements had taught him humility and respect for expertise he'd previously dismissed as bureaucratic paperwork. He'd sent me a handwritten letter apologizing for his role in the debacle and thanking me for the educational experience. David's professional rehabilitation had proved more challenging. After Morrison Financial terminated his partnership, he'd accepted a junior analyst position at Midwest Regional Investments for approximately $35,000 annually, less than half my former salary at Marcus's company. His client base had evaporated completely, and his reputation within financial circles remained permanently damaged. The securities violations investigation concluded with formal censure from the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority and 5 years of enhanced supervision for any future employment in investment management. David's dreams of building a prestigious financial consulting practice had ended permanently due to his scheme to profit from my termination. He'd sent several apologetic text messages over the past months, acknowledging his mistakes and requesting family reconciliation. I'd responded politely but maintained appropriate boundaries, explaining that trust required time to rebuild and consistent demonstration of changed behavior rather than simple apologies. My consulting practice had grown beyond anything I'd imagined possible during those dark days following Dad's funeral. Precision Dynamics Corporation had become my anchor client, leading to referrals from their suppliers, partners, and even former competitors who recognized the value of proactive compliance management. The scholarship fund I'd established in Dad's memory had awarded its first grants to 3 young women pursuing technical certifications in manufacturing and engineering. The recipients reminded me of myself 20 years earlier. Intelligent, determined, and eager to prove themselves in male-dominated industries through expertise and dedication rather than politics or connections. Mom had recovered gradually from her grief while finding new purpose in managing the scholarship foundation. She'd converted Dad's workshop into a small office where she interviewed candidates and reviewed applications, ensuring that his legacy of teaching and mentoring would continue benefiting future generations. "Your father would be so proud of how you handled this situation," Mom had told me during our weekly dinner the previous Sunday. "He always said that integrity and hard work would triumph over shortcuts and dishonesty. You proved him right in the most difficult circumstances imaginable." The life lesson had become crystal clear through 6 months of dramatic reversals and unexpected opportunities. Professional value isn't determined by salary negotiations, office politics, or family connections, but by developing irreplaceable expertise and maintaining ethical standards regardless of external pressures. Marcus and David had both learned that specialized knowledge couldn't be eliminated through cost-cutting measures or dismissed as unnecessary overhead. Their attempts to profit from my perceived weaknesses had ultimately exposed their own fundamental limitations and poor judgment, creating consequences far beyond their imagination. Standing in my thriving consulting firm, surrounded by evidence of professional success built on expertise and integrity, I reflected on how losing one job had led to finding my true calling. Sometimes the worst experiences create opportunities for growth that wouldn't have been possible within comfortable but limiting circumstances. The federal investigation that began with my wrongful termination had expanded to review practices throughout the regional manufacturing industry, leading to improved safety standards and compliance protocols that would protect workers and communities for years to come. My willingness to speak truth about regulatory violations had created positive changes far beyond my personal situation. As I prepared for my afternoon presentation to the State Manufacturing Council about compliance best practices, I thought about Dad's workshop lessons that had shaped my understanding of craftsmanship and dedication. He'd taught me that quality work required patience, precision, and unwavering commitment to standards, even when others pressured you to take shortcuts. Expertise is earned through years of study and practice, Dad used to say while teaching me to measure twice and cut once. Anyone can copy techniques, but true understanding comes only through experience and dedication to excellence. His wisdom had guided me through the darkest period of my professional life and emerged stronger on the other side. The brother who called me a financial amateur and the boss who dismissed my expertise as worthless had both discovered that specialized knowledge commands respect precisely because it can't be replicated through wishful thinking or family connections. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone dismissed your expertise only to realize later how valuable it truly was? I'd love to hear about times when your specialized knowledge proved irreplaceable despite others' initial skepticism. Please share your experiences in the comments below. Your stories might inspire someone facing similar challenges. Thank you for following along with my journey from wrongful termination to professional triumph. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to show your support. Subscribe to hear more stories about overcoming workplace challenges, and share this with anyone who might benefit from learning about the true value of expertise and integrity. Remember, your specialized knowledge and ethical standards are your greatest professional assets. Never let anyone convince you otherwise, even during the most difficult circumstances. Sometimes losing everything leads to finding opportunities you never imagined possible.